Hi, I'm Mandy Medley. I'm one of the co-owners and workers at Pilsen Community Books, a worker cooperative and radical bookstore in the Pilsen neighborhood of Chicago. And I'm so excited to welcome you here tonight for an event in celebration of Palestine, a Socialist Introduction, which is just out last year from Haymarket Books. I have a few notes about how this evening will go. In a few seconds, I'm going to turn it over to my comrade Eric Wallenberg to run the event, and there'll be a discussion and conversation. And at the end, we will have time for a few questions. So if you have any questions at all during the event, feel free to just drop them in the chat. We'll make sure they're incorporated at the correct time. If there are any technical difficulties, the stream's interrupted, just go back to our YouTube channel, and we'll resume streaming shortly. It's easy to find. And finally, I would be a terrible bookseller if I did not mention that you can purchase Palestine, a Socialist Introduction from Pilsen Community Books on our website, pilsencommunitybooks.com, or also Haymarket, I believe, has the ebook for free, so get it from one of those two great places. And so now, without further ado, I'll turn it over to Eric Wallenberg.
Great, thanks so much, Mandy. It is very exciting to have this group of people with us tonight to celebrate the publication of, can we see that, Palestine, a Socialist Introduction, invaluable resource here if you're an activist fighting for Palestinian liberation in solidarity with Palestinians fighting for their own liberation. So with us tonight, we have the editors, the co-editors of the book, Sumaya Awad. Sumaya is a Palestinian writer and member of DSA in New York City. She's currently director of strategy at Adala Justice Project and co-editor of the book Palestine, a Socialist Introduction. Brian Bean is a Chicago-based socialist activist, a writer and speaker, originally from North Carolina. He's one of the founding editors of Rampant magazine and a member of the Tempest Socialist Collective. His work has been published in Jacobin, Socialist Worker, Red Flag, International Viewpoint, among others, and of course is a co-editor of this volume. And last but not least, Daphna Thier is a socialist and organizer based in Brooklyn, New York, as well as a member of the DSA National Political Education Committee. She writes occasionally for Jacobin magazine, and Daphna is also a contributing author to the collection that we are celebrating here tonight. So we're so happy to have you all with us. And I should introduce myself. I'm Eric Wallenberg. I guess relevant for this, I'm acquisitions editor at Science for the People, where last year we edited an issue on science under occupation with several articles on Palestine and from Palestinians. And have worked on Palestine solidarity for some time. So I thought we would just start tonight with a basic intro to the book. So hoping that you can tell us about why you decided to write a specific socialist case for Palestine. What's unique about this socialist case, and why and how are these two tied together?
Thanks, Eric, Mandy, and Pilsen Community Books for inviting us. I'm excited for this conversation. I meant to wear my PCB T-shirt, but I left it, and I'm traveling now, so sadly I can't rep y'all. But I think to start out, to kind of provide a context as far as why we wrote the book, really I want to go back to 2008, because two important things happened in 2008 that I think laid out the trajectory of what we're talking about today. And that is the global financial crash, in which capitalism had its biggest crisis since the 30s. It's still ongoing in a certain way, and people all around the world saw states and the capitalist class bail out the billionaires at the price of working people's living conditions. I think the other thing that happened in 2008 was Israel's bombing of Gaza in what the Israeli state calls Operation Cast Lead, in which about 2,000 Palestinians were killed in a 2-week period. And what's interesting about that, obviously violence committed against Gaza and Palestinians is not something that is exceptional, but unfortunately, traumatically quite normal. But those events were seen around the world through social media, and I think sparked a new sort of energy in people focusing on the Palestinian cause. And both of those events, I think, laid out a trajectory of radicalism around both the issues of socialism, so response to the crisis of capitalism, and that of justice in Palestine. And these aren't new ideas. The Palestinian liberation movement has talked about the need to combat imperialism and connect liberation for Palestine with confronting capitalism, for decades. But I think that what we see now is a new importance of linking them, and so that is what we hope to do with this book, which is to lay out sort of the socialist perspective of fighting for justice in Palestine, which is both that having a just solution to Palestine in the Middle East is going to require a confrontation with capitalism. And I think the second piece of that is that socialists in the West, and especially in the United States, have a special responsibility to fight for Palestine. I think that those two twin interlocking perspectives is really sort of what drives the different aspects of the book. And I want to sort of talk about those two aspects very briefly, and then get to the conversation. But the first is the need to confront capitalism regionally, and I think that we have seen that argument, which was made by the Palestinian left in the '60s, drawn upon the understanding that in order for the Zionist state to be implanted in the region, it required the backing of imperial powers. It required the military and financial backing to carry out the settler colonial project. And that has been continuing as the Nakba of 1948 still continues and still has the backing of imperial powers as the $3.8 billion per year of the U.S. Channels out, as all the political support that the U.S. Funnels into the region. And I think that we have seen that argument even become more obvious and stark with the way in which many of the Arab states have now normalized relationships with Israel, which is a process that's been something the U.S. has wanted for since the '70s at least. But under Trump, it has rapidly increased, and Biden has shown no interest in doing anything different. Indeed, it's something that he praised Trump for. And so, what drives this global capitalism's interest in propping up the Israeli state, and that is to secure a stronghold in a region that is strategically really important for geopolitical reasons, for shipping, for oil, for new circuits of finance that come from the GCC, and all these sorts of things. And so when we see the situation as it is now, in which the two-state solution in its atrophied form of post-Oslo, in which the Palestinian Authority is managers of an occupation, no real benefit to Palestinian people. What drives that? And it's like, well, because the global capitalist class see this normalization of the Arab states, of even a nascent Palestinian capitalist class, as something that's in their interest. And so sort of seeing the need to confront capitalism regionally, because confronting capitalism means confronting imperialism, and Israel is a sort of a key section in that. And then the other piece is why socialists in the West, particularly the U.S., should see Palestine as something that they should champion. And I think that there's a simple answer to that. One is that socialists need to be on the side of the oppressed, and the United States is the prime backer of the Israeli state, monetarily and politically, as I laid out. The U.S. has its special relationship with Israel, and so that means that U.S. socialists need to have a special emphasis on fighting our own state's perpetuation and backing of this terrorist state that Israel is. I think the other piece of that too is about how Israel is key to U.S. imperialism. That is part of the reason why they established this special relationship, to ensure hegemony over the oil-rich region, and it's something that continues. And so when we talk about imperialism, when we talk about the way in which the military budget is exorbitant at the cost of all the things like healthcare and housing that regular working people need, and sort of the money that goes to fund that, then socialists have to take that up. And so taking that up means taking up something that is central to the U.S. imperial project, which is Palestine. And I'll close with, I think, that the events of the past couple months, with the tremendously heroic uprising all over historic Palestine, I think just show that even more. in which many of the youth activists are rebelling both against the sort of ongoing and deepening settler colonial ethnic cleansing of the Zionist entity, and at the same time against the two-state so-called solution that they see as decrepit, and the way that the PA continues to basically manage the occupation for Israel. And so it's against those two things. So we see there that kind of the hope and the promise of a sort of an uprising and rebellion against the status quo and the forces that be. And we saw it globally. We saw protests all over the world, 100,000 or so in London. There was 15,000 here in Chicago, a couple over the course of the days. And what really is, I think, that the biggest global series of protests against imperialism since the Gulf War. And so we see how these things are linked together. And so that's sort of the arguments that we make in the book. We hope that it's like a guidebook for activists, and kind of makes these two arguments for the adoption of a socialist perspective, both here and abroad, to kind of continue to draw together and strengthen relationships that are already organically drawn together and quite strong, but to make them more solid and capable of being a tool to fight for liberation for Palestinians.
Great, thanks a lot for that introduction. Before we dig into some of the details of this history, which I think you laid out a lot there, so we definitely want to try to dig down a little bit there. I'm wondering if we can start with today, because it does feel like we just went through this spring watching this really brutal attack, another brutal attack on Gaza by Israel, certainly backed, by the U.S. and many other interests around the world. So I'm just wondering if, at the same time, there's this growing frustration, I mean, just over the past couple of weeks, right, where we see the resistance to the repressive tactics of the PA, the Palestinian Authority, by the people of Palestine. So you have these two things going on. And then at the same time, as Brian just laid out, this really growing grassroots identification with the Palestinian struggle, right, where there's just massive demonstrations against this brutality that Palestinians faced this spring. So I'm just wondering if you can situate us in this moment, sort of update us on the significance of these struggles this spring, and kind of where things stand at the moment. Whoever wants to take that.
I can start. Thanks, Eric, and thanks, Mandy, and Pilsen Books. So I think there's a lot to try to unpack for what's happening today, and I'm going to try to keep it brief, but know that it's not a full picture. I think what we're seeing first is that Israel is becoming increasingly right-wing, and we can talk about that in a little bit. I know Daphna has a lot to say about that. And what it means for a settler colonial state to become increasingly right-wing is really scary, right? Because its origins are already, as right-wing as you can get, or so we thought. And what that means is that the government is becoming unabashedly racist. There's no longer this attempt to sugarcoat what Israel's project is, right? The ethnic cleansing is ongoing. Settlements are expanding. Even during the protests in May, when the global spotlight was on Sheikh Jarrah, the neighborhood of Jerusalem that was being ethnically cleansed, and Silwan, and when Israel was bombing Gaza, they were also building a brand new settlement, and have continued since. And so they're expanding, even as they're receiving more and more condemnation and more attention for what they're doing, despite the fact that Human Rights Watch, one of the largest human rights organizations, charged Israel with apartheid and persecution. And there's actually calls for sanctions right now, which we haven't seen since probably the 70s. So there's this movement that is growing, that wants to hold Israel accountable. I think there's no doubt about that increasingly people are suspicious of what Israel is doing, and suspicious of this blind support that Israel gets, and specifically here in the U.S., which is Israel's largest backer financially and politically, although Israel doesn't depend on U.S. funds as much as it used to, and happy to talk more about that later if people are interested. But what that means is that it's Israel has in its sight that it's going to take all of the land from the river to the sea, and that it won't stop unless it's forced to stop, which in some ways is no surprise at all, right? Because it's a settler colonial state. Like, that's what we should expect when its project is so clear. When Zionism says, the Zionist project from the very beginning was actually to take up even more land. And so now they're fulfilling that. At the same time, there's this, people have called it an awakening on the ground in Palestine, where there's this new generation of Palestinians that are pushing for this to end, and doing so in a very unapologetic, confrontational way. That's saying, no, you are the occupiers, we are the occupied. You are the oppressors, we are the oppressed. And we refuse to let this happen. And completely abandoning, and rightly so, I think, all the rhetoric that tries to stifle or restrict Palestine advocates into the sphere of humanitarianism. That we are all just these passive victims that need your financial aid, and saying, actually, no, we're not. This is a political situation. It requires a lot more than aid. We don't want U.S. aid. That's not going to solve the problem. We don't want the U.S. to be funding our oppressors and then giving us some money on the side. What we actually want is an end to this funding stream and an end to this occupation, the end to the colonization of our land. And we want it back. We want all of it back because it is our land. And we want to build Palestine. And a lot of that has come out through people like Muhammad al-Kurd and Mariam Barghouti and others. But it's also a lot of organizations, grassroots organizations on the ground, that are also pushing for change internally. And that's what we've seen with the protests in the West Bank that Eric just mentioned against the Palestinian Authority. So the Palestinian Authority, I think, is really a reflection of the decades of negotiations and these diplomatic events, like that whole paradigm of diplomacy and negotiations that reigned in the 90s, and that failed, that utterly failed. That was, promising some abstract idea of Palestinian statehood and sovereignty, and that actually ended up being entrenched apartheid, an expansion of settlements, and the Palestinian Authority becoming the managers of occupation. I think that's entirely right. Where they imprisoned Palestinians, where they worked closely with Israeli security forces, and where this Palestinian ruling class was developed as a result, upper middle class and ruling class, that has benefited off of the ongoing occupation, off of ongoing negotiations. Of course, the culprit is the Israeli occupation, but that doesn't mean that the Palestinian Authority is not complicit, and is not benefiting from this prolonged crisis. And so that's why Palestinians are rising up against the Palestinian Authority and demanding that the PA be dismantled, that it release all the political prisoners that it has, that it stops working with Israeli security forces, and also, and this is really crucial, demanding that it stops participating in these IMF and World Bank organized development plans that actually just entrench poverty for Palestinians, specifically Palestinian refugees, and that also work to fragment Palestine in ways, or entrenching the fragmentation that Israel has already begun. So Gaza and the West Bank, that are treated as two completely different entities, when in fact this is all Palestinian land. And so trying to again revive the organizing and the communication and the political reality of Palestinians in Gaza and Palestinians in the West Bank and Palestinians in Israel are all Palestinians living on Palestinian land. And I think that's what made the Unity Intifada, as it was called in May, so important, because it was, there was a national strike called on that day, and Palestinians across all of historic Palestine rose up together under one unified call. And you had Palestinians in Jordan, marching to the border, in Lebanon, where one was shot actually, in Iraq, trying to make it to the Jordanian border, wanting to go to Palestine. And, you hadn't seen something like that in decades. Some have said since the 1936 revolt, but it's been a long time. And I think this is all part of this new period where we're going to see a lot more organizing on the ground. And there's this shift in consciousness, both in Palestine, but also globally around the world, as people are coming to terms with, oh, this is happening and we're funding it, or we're supporting it, or we're silent about it. And I don't think it's a coincidence that this is happening as the left is growing, certainly in the US, but also elsewhere in the world, and also the right is growing. And I think we have to sort of grapple with all of these things. And the one thing I'll just end by saying is that I think one of the things that the book does that really puts forward is, and people should go read this chapter in the book in particular, is that it's not just saying here's the history, here's what's happening, but it's also saying here's how you can participate, here's what you can do about it. And it offers the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement as a response to that. I'll stop there.
Excellent. And so maybe I want to transition over to get Daphna's take on some of these questions, but I do just want to say that, I mean, in many ways, this book really shows how the 1948 Nakba, the catastrophe, has never ended, right? The terror inflicted on Palestinians, the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, to create a Zionist state, a Jewish-centered state, is really all throughout this. You get the sense of this is not, it's not stagnant. This didn't happen, 50, 60, 70 years ago. And I'm just wondering if you can talk about this ongoing process. So, for instance, the basic law that you all talk about in the book that passed a couple of years back, and the other kinds of ways that the Nakba continues to unfold daily for Palestinians. And so maybe, Daphna, you might take this question a little further.
Yeah, I mean, I can try. I guess I think it, Sumaya was saying this earlier when she was speaking, that basically, we have this right-wing facade, or we have lost the facade of a sort of liberal Zionism that we used to have. Now it's very clear, it's very right-wing, but that it's always been what it's been doing. And then you think about we're watching as thousands of people are struggling against dispossession, and if you look back 1948, with tens of thousands killed and hundreds of thousands expelled, and then you have 1967 again, 10,000 fatalities and people expelled once more, some people for a second time, obviously. So this is really, that was when the Labor government was in power. And then there's been this clear shift to the right, basically with the end of the Oslo Accords, which frankly was a huge win for Israel, right? Because it left the Palestinian territory completely fragmented and fully under Israeli control. That gave rise obviously to the Second Intifada, but now there was no more need for lip service to ending occupation, and actually, today it's not a popular position in Israeli society. So, and the government as it is today under Naftali Bennett is ironically, right, is the broadest coalition of parties yet, from the right wing and religious Zionists to all the way to the sort of center left, if you can really call that, Labor and Meretz, or Havodah and Meretz, and even an Islamist Palestinian party. But really, it's the government that has the most right-wing mandate that's ever been. And so, and the left, that so-called left, has embraced that mandate almost immediately, because ultimately they see themselves closer to the right than to Palestinians. And I think Sumaya's right, like that kind of growing chasm between Zionist colonization that had these lofty ideals in the past, and what we're actually seeing through the social media window that we now have is this really ugly right-wing face. And that's putting things, kind of making people have to choose a side, I think. And especially for Jews in the US, I think that's always been a major source of support for Israel. And that support is clearly cracking. And of course, there's the Black progressive support for Palestinians that in the wake of Black Lives Matter, they've made connections between their own oppression and Palestinian oppression, and there's just generally that politicization that as Sumaya was saying, and I think that means that we have very good reason to be hopeful right now in a way that I think before we never had so much hope. This is certainly the most hopeful I've ever been about the prospects of the end of apartheid. because of that increasing scrutiny and the ability of Palestinians to get their voice across. Hasbara was the Israeli, it's a word. The word actually means explanation, and it was Israeli public relations in the international community. Well, today Hasbara is having a very difficult time because they can really no longer explain things that we're all seeing so clearly. And if you look now with what's happening in Silwan and Sheikh Jarrah, these are people who were already expelled twice, really, from 1948 and then 1967, or they're in homes that were given to them by the Jordanian government, and now they're fighting to hold on to those homes that Israel would like to take. So this is a very clearly just a consistent approach of colonization, and there's just no way to make colonization anything other than a right-wing project. That's what I would say.
Great, thanks so much, Daphna. So just having laid out some of the stakes, I wanted to establish just a sense here of what's happening today and getting a sense of the stakes of this argument and why people should actually be thinking about the importance of reading this book, of knowing this history. I wonder if we can turn to look at some of the roots of Zionism. So looking at the origins of Zionism, I think in some ways, right, it was a reaction to the horrors of global imperialism and anti-Semitism, the anti-Semitism that accompanied, all of the imperial fights of the 19th and 20th centuries. But it was profoundly pessimistic, I think, is the way that, we might think of it, compared to, right, the growth of the socialist movement. So this is really, I feel like, the heart of the book here. Really, it shines in kind of giving an alternative to what Zionism is as a socialist alternative, which really thrived in Jewish communities throughout Europe, in particular, but also, in the Middle East and North Africa. So I'm wondering if you can take us through some of this history, these differing reactions to anti-Semitism, right? Zionism on the one hand and socialism on the other. So I don't know who would like to field that, or all of you might want to say something.
I can start. Just some basic. Okay. Well, I think first of all, Zionism took hold very small numbers, really, compared to other more progressive ways of thinking, and also it took hold more among the kind of middle and lower middle class of Jews. It didn't nearly get as much of a foothold into the Jewish working class, which was much more drawn to the communist parties and to the Bund. If we're talking about Eastern Europe, and it was really in the context of nationalist movements, and at a time when colonization wasn't yet understood fully as a concept. So for some Jewish workers that did sort of take to it, even there, they joined what was called Palestinian, which was the sort of left wing or the communist version of Zionism, and their ranks often interchanged, or they changed into Communist Party members, or and they were often accused by committed Zionists that they cared too much about the plight of Jewish workers in Poland and Russia and Eastern Europe. So I say, the truth is that the Jews in those areas experienced very, very harsh, very violent repression, and they were some of the most radical workers. And they tended to, even ahead of their own, non-Jewish workers in those countries, they would build organization, they would build strike funds, they developed connections to the Bund and to unions and to the communist parties, and that I would say is really the true legacy of that period. And so Zionism was very small at that time. And even in Palestine, among the Jewish workers, there were very few that had actually any intention of going to Palestine. Of course, things changed rapidly around World War II, at a time when Jewish refugees were turned away from other places. And the Zionist movement actively colluded and to bring in Jews from Europe to Palestine. So they weren't in any way helping to mitigate against that or trying to advocate for Jews to just go anywhere that was safe. They had a very clear agenda. And if you look at that history and then you look at what the Zionists did just 2.5 years later to Palestinians, it's really a slap in the face, right? A genocide committed against Jews in Europe, and then turn around and commit that same act of genocide against Palestinian people, and there's no element of justice to that, right? Those are not the people who, if anything, it completely absolves white Europe of what it did. I don't know if I've answered that question actually properly, but that's, I'd say. I'd say Zionism was a reactionary ideology that thought that there was no cure to anti-Semitism and that Jews had to be separated. And actually, the reality for most Jews up until the experience of World War II was that they were deeply connected to building a working class movement within their own countries.
Fantastic. Sumaya or Brian, do you want to add anything? I know, Sumaya, you have a co-written chapter, I think, early in the book that deals with some of these questions too. So if you want to add anything, or Brian, feel free.
I could add something, but Sumaya, do you want to go first? Yeah, I think Daphna laid out expertly, I think, the trajectory and the context. I think just the other thing to add that I think speaks to today is seeing the problem of what is happening there as that of Zionism, and that being really essential for the socialist project. And, at the time, there was a certain left-wing gloss on settler colonialism there, unfortunately. And so many, groups like the Stalinist Communist Party at first was for the creation of the state of Israel. And there's a number of just, I think, failures of the left internationally to really grasp that Zionism is not something that is progressive, but is this pessimistic ideology that Daphna laid out, and it is the waging of settler colonialism. And so I think what that means today is just how important it is to sort of call that out. And so, someone like Bernie Sanders, who has been a reflection of this radicalization in a really important way, I think still in many of the statements that he has put out has, been stronger than he has been in the past on the questions of the crimes committed by the state of Israel, but at the same time, not saying, hey, the problem is the Zionist project. Like that trajectory, that perspective is one that is irreconcilable with justice because it's racist and it's apartheid, and it needs to go away as a political project. And that's how we'll achieve justice for Palestinians and remove the main barriers of solidarity for Jewish workers in Israel. And so I think that that basic full-throated understanding of Zionism is racism, socialists are opposed at full stop, clearly is something that I think has come a long way on the left in a really positive way. I think we need to sort of keep pushing to make sure that it is sharp, clear, and grasped by everybody on the left.
Great, thank you. That is all a really helpful formulation for thinking about this. I want to think a little bit about the question of Zionism today. So Daphna, you've already talked a little bit about, Israel today and some of the, the recent elections and that sort of bizarre setup that we now have. But you also write in the book about the limits of the Israeli working class and that they cannot really be a liberatory class for the Palestinian struggle. And I'm wondering if you can explain this, because this is a central central component we think about in socialism is that the working class is going to liberate itself and the rest of humanity. And so there's a contradiction here that you point out. And then I'm wondering if maybe also Brian and Sumaya after that might talk a little bit about the role of the larger working class in the region and the role they might play or have played in Palestinian liberation, or sort of the limits of that role. So we can kind of think about the role of the working class here. That would be great.
Yeah, I mean, in a nutshell, basically, at the core of it, this is apartheid. So it's also apartheid labor. They, by and large, Jews and Palestinians are not working shoulder to shoulder. They're not competing for jobs or sharing working conditions. There's practically, for most of them, with some exceptions, some notable exceptions, a separate economy, right? It's different income. And while they both pay into taxes, one set of workers also benefits disproportionately from the services of the state. One set of workers has benefited from access not only to jobs and education, but also to land and construction. One set of workers thrives off the existence of the arms and occupation economy in a way that I think is sort of similar to the way that a prison community might thrive off of the prison population. And there's very high rates in Israeli society of workers in high-tech industries and high rates of managerial and professionals. And I think, the significance of that is that while Palestinians lack basic democratic rights, they can't organize themselves. And while Israelis are benefiting from them not having those democratic rights, they're not going to be their allies in the process. So, we have to think about how we strengthen Palestinian rights so that they can organize themselves. And that could be, much more powerful source for change. And I'll let Brian and Sumaya speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, briefly, I think that the role of workers across the region has been very important and will continue to be to really affect any real change. I mean, we say this in the book over and over again: Palestine will not be liberated in isolation. And part of what we mean by that is that it's going to be part of a movement across the whole region that rises up against austerity, against the dictators that are propped up across the region, against imperialism, U.S. or other. And the role of Arab workers is essential to that, especially when you think about the different reform plans that I mentioned earlier, like the IMF, World Bank reform plans that were instituted in Palestine, in Egypt, in Jordan, and the goal that the U.S. has of creating like a single economic zone across the region, right, stretching from Morocco to the Gulf, with Israel and the wealthy Gulf countries as sort of the two poles of capital, and then the money can flow freely, and exploit workers, essentially free labor, very, very cheap, nothing is regulated, in all of these qualified industrial zones. And that's what we've seen happen in the last 10 years. It was disrupted by the Arab Spring, by the protests that shook the Middle East during the Arab Spring, and some of which are ongoing. But that's still the plan. And that's part of why the U.S. is so, so keen to see more of these normalization deals go through. It was Trump that started them, but, Biden is just going to keep pushing for them because it actually benefits the U.S. ruling class, businesses, these large corporations like Walmart, for example, right, that operates in these qualified industrial zones in Egypt and in Jordan and Palestine. And I think also another part of that, it's just the role of U.S. workers and the labor movement here and unions here, and how much power they have, and also helping to disrupt the funding to Israel and helping build consciousness among working class Americans about what is happening, why this is important, how this is part of, the larger foreign policy plan or U.S. militarism, and why it's so important to dismantle that entirely. because it also affects a number of issues here in the U.S., from policing to climate change, everything. I mean, it's all connected. And we really try to bring that across in the book, that Palestine isn't isolated. We don't care about Palestine just because. We're not focusing on Israel just because, but it actually plays a very important role in the U.S. and sort of the U.S. government, the U.S. establishment's ability to continue to oppress and exploit workers, and sort of the reverberations of that across the globe.
Could I add one thing to that, Eric? Yeah, I wanted to just underscore, I think, something that Sumaya said about how in the book we talk about seeing it not in isolation and seeing its connection to the need for regional revolt, and that also being sort of international. And so I think that that oftentimes can sound like an abstract thing, like regional revolt is the path to liberation. What does that mean? And I think that really going back and looking through the course of the Arab Spring in 2011 and the second wave in 2019 is really instructive and important to look at, in which many ways the organizing that led to the revolution in Egypt in 2011 began with organizing solidarity with the Second Intifada. And so there's a way in which the cause of Palestine is seen as something that has great sort of purchase across the working class regionally, because it is the most clear example of foreign domination, even though many of the states have rulers who are backed and sort of propped up by foreign domination. And so this led to the Egyptian revolution. And then there's a process that can go back too. And so after the first kind of section of the Egyptian revolution, we saw in Land Day in Palestine, people marched to the borders. So people were going to march to the borders to return in mass. And so you see the way in which the cause of Palestine is something that has a generative effect to struggle globally, and also how that struggle can lift up people in Palestine as well, and how that those struggles have an international dimension too. So the effects of the Arab Spring was obviously a regional uprising, but it had international reverberations. The Occupy movement, I think, is directly connected to that, and I think we saw that again in 2019 with the second wave of the revolutions in Sudan, Algeria, and Lebanon and Iraq, in which in Lebanon, for example, many right before the sort of uprising sort of kicked off, there was a lot of protest activity led by Palestinian Syrian refugees against changes to the refugee situation there. So again, it is a detonator. And of course, 2019, the revolutions in Algeria and Sudan and sort of attempted revolutions elsewhere, really set off a year of global revolt that I think was temporarily put on pause because of the global pandemic. But I think the U.S. is one exception with the uprising that we saw last summer. I think that we've seen reverberations of that coming again. So when we talk about sort of, revolt and the power of the sort of working class to sort of upset and change minds and upset structures, I think it's a very concrete thing. And looking at these struggles, I think provide, it's not rose-colored glasses. It's not perfect, and there are many sort of tragic consequences as revolts, but kind of an echo of the possible of what we need.
Thanks. That was really helpful to hear from all of you on this question. We've got a couple of questions that came in that were sort of along this line of discussion that I wanted to follow up on. And I want to start by just saying my union, the Professional Staff Congress, which represents faculty, staff, and graduate students at CUNY, the City University of New York, 30,000 members, just passed a hard-won resolution in support of Palestinian struggle against apartheid. It calls for an end to U.S. aid to Israel. It affirms individual union members' right to engage in BDS. And then I think most importantly, it calls on union members to organize discussions about BDS on campuses across the city, and then to report back to the delegates assembly at the end of the year. So I'm in New York now. I'm not teaching there right now, but still in the union. And it was so impressive to see this being organized from afar. And really I don't think the union leadership was very happy with it. I think they sort of had to accept it because there was a massive grassroots campaign across the university, 20 some campuses, to really try to get this resolution some teeth. And it's just really impressive. And so I was hoping you all might say, I don't follow this closely enough, but I'm hoping you could talk a little bit how you see this struggle moving forward in the U.S. In particular, thinking about the centrality of the working class in terms of putting some concrete, muscle behind some of the movement. So not just demonstrations in the street, which are important, but how do you actually start to exert some more power at unions or in unorganized workplaces, right? Most people aren't unionized in this country. So how do you do that in sort of unorganized workplaces? Can you give us examples of where the struggle stands today, or examples of unions organizing for solidarity with Palestine, or even just what steps people might take to just start to try to move this discussion forward or move this movement forward? And just with that, I want to say we did have a question in particular, if people want to take different elements of this. Somebody who was saying, what do you do if we live abroad, if we don't live in the US? They didn't say where they live, but if there's international struggles, how they can contribute to the effort. And then a question too, just about this new administration, the Biden administration, and sort of where things stand in terms of where we can sort of leverage any kind of a fight back there. Don't all jump at once now.
I mean, I can start. I feel like I already forgot the first question, but hopefully whatever I say will at least touch on that. I think it's hard to answer the question about what to do when you're outside of the US, because it kind of depends on where you are. The call from Palestinians is to organize, to uplift the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement, which, see how your government is involved in helping prop up Israel, what campaigns are ongoing where you are. Could you start one? And to do so in coordination with this global movement to put pressure to end Israeli apartheid and settler colonialism. So that's my vague answer to that question. I think in terms of where things are at in the US, and I think that was a question from Eric, and what to do going forward, there are so many things right now sort of unfolding in the US in different spheres. So, in the sphere of Congress, for example, which used to be so weak, and some would argue still is, but where there are these splinters happening, and there's, actual discussion about Palestine, about uncritical U.S. support for Israel, about BDS, that are now happening, on the floors of Congress that we haven't seen before, and that the last 3 years I think has really been a shift. And one sort of concrete example of this is a bill, HR 2590, that calls for the end to using U.S. funding for the detention of children, for home demolitions, for land theft. And that's been supported by, I think, over 16 members of Congress now, but over 200 organizations. The vast majority of them have nothing to do with Palestine, and they're just other social justice organizations. So everything from Movement for Black Lives to Sunrise Movement to DSA's Medicare for All, etc. So really entrenching the point and bringing home the point that actually Palestine is connected to all of these domestic struggles we're fighting for, and we can't separate them. We can't separate imperialism from all of this. So I think that's one thing. The other is different campaigns, different BDS campaigns. I think one of the most recent ones was Block the Boat, which is people are organizing to block Israeli ships from unloading or from loading and then taking weapons. Some of them have been weapons ships back to Israel. And that's been successful, actually. So the Bay Area had a very successful campaign. There was some organizing in New York City here where I am, in New Jersey, and elsewhere as well, and this is ongoing. But also just the sort of the way that divestment campaigns have picked up in the U.S. as well on college campuses. The fact that now BDS is debated in the mainstream, and it used to be a few years ago where if you talked about BDS, you would just kind of be isolated and shut out and smeared as anti-Semitic, and all of that still happens. But there's also a strong movement against that, and one that's growing. And I think that the fact that the attacks have become more vicious just points to that the movement is working, that BDS is slowly working, and that there's a lot of potential. Whether or not we realize that potential, TBD. But there is a lot of potential, especially right now. So I think that's my short answer for where things are right now in the U.S.
Daphna, do you want to go or you want me to?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think just two quick things. I think that BDS is what Palestinian civil society asked for people outside of Palestine to do, so that's the obvious answer. And I think how you apply that is where the kind of rubber hits the road. And the kind of nice thing about boycott, divestment, sanction is that there's so many ways to apply that, because in the U.S. particularly, so many things are economically connected to Israel. And so I think in the U.S., the BDS movement, I think in its first big, powerful surge occurred on college campuses. And that was really important. That's the reason why the Israeli state spends millions of dollars to influence U.S. college campuses, which is like really weird if you think about it. But different than where else in the world is, it has been historically very weak in the labor movement, which has a certain degree of power and force. And so I think that after this last bombardment of Gaza and the sort of heroic resistance across historic Palestine, we've seen, Sumaya mentioned a number of those, just a pretty sizable wave of resolutions, either very strongly worded against Israel's actions, but even more importantly, sanctioning BDS and sort of being in solidarity with it. The Seattle Teachers Union, the San Francisco Teachers Union, so a number of places I think have had historic wins. I think that passing a resolution in support of BDS is different than actually having a campaign to make that support of BDS be a BDS campaign. So I think we can't get too excited about it, but it is historic and a big opening, because people are thinking about how I can fight for justice in Palestine in my workplace, and that's really important. And so I think that's something that people should continue to push on, raise resolutions in your trade unions, but also figure out how to actually have campaigns against pensions, against sort of economic connections. And then I think that the last thing is just talking about sanctions against Israel. I think because of the movement just getting started, sanctions against Israel, I think, wasn't talked about on the level of the federal government in the same way. I think some of the stuff in Congress that Sumaya mentioned, I think shows some openings for it. And I think the role of socialists with that is just continue to push that that we need to have sanctions. They need to be sort of quite profound, in which it's not we want to condition aid, but I think a lot of folks in the left in Congress have talked about, we want aid to Israel ended. And so I think that sort of push alongside of important resolutions like HR 2590 that Sumaya mentioned, that I've sat in my congressman's office demanding that she back too. But I think sort of raising the question of sanctions and not conditioning aid but ending it, as well as trying to continue to push BDS to be more important and embedded in the U.S. trade union movement.
Daphna, would you like to add any final words on either that question or anything else that we've covered here?
Yeah, I would just say, there is a way in which I think it's really important to connect the Palestinian struggle internationally to a lot of those. And I think we talked to some degree already, but there's really, from the very beginning, just to go back to the kind of historical outlook, Israel, before it was founded, we're talking 19th century, when they just first started writing about Zionism. They saw it as what could be potentially a French colonial outpost, right? And then they tried to curry favor with the Ottoman Empire. When the British occupied Palestine, they turned to them. They became close collaborators in quelling the Palestinian labor strikes and the peasant resistance in the late 30s. They were armed and trained by the British. After World War II, they enjoyed also Soviet patronage as well as British and French. You know, that kind of myth of like this small army against all these Arab armies is completely false, because they were armed by imperialist powers. And then after the formation of the state, they received all this aid from Western Germany and from the US. That basically helped set up the entire society. After the 60s, this kind of gets to the question that I saw in the chat, but you know, after the 67 war, the Six-Day War, the US becomes much more heavily involved. They sort of see very clearly the asset that Israel can be in the region, and they get more involved specifically in military aid, as opposed to, you know, kind of moving away from funding settlers directly, but actually funding the military more directly. And today, while they don't pay as big a portion into the military through aid, they do pay quite a bit, and they maintain relationships through arms deals and loans. And if you look just at what during the Israeli assault on Gaza, just this past May, Biden approved a $735 million precision-guided weapons arms sale to Israel. And Israel, you know, since the 70s and 80s, has actually become one of the world's largest arms dealers, highest arms sales per capita. So in a sense, their entire economy really rests on the arms economy. And I say all of this because they are so part of that imperialist world order. They specialize in drones and surveillance and security high tech. They have contributed to the geopolitical balances. You know, Israel is basically the only nuclear power, right, in the Middle East. And they collaborate with the U.S. in every way, and they've supplied arms and training to authoritarian regimes all in many countries, some of which use those arms and training to massacre thousands of left-wing dissidents. So there is a place here for connecting between the movements. And in fact, you saw in Colombia when there was that upsurge, they burned flags, American flags and Israeli flags, because they made that connection between that American world order that Israel is so deeply connected to. And if we can do that, if we can make those connections, that international connection, if we can say Israel is a reactionary state that actually winds up supporting the very same forces that defeat my movement, well then, you know, we have a world order we could change.
Beautifully said. Thank you, Daphna. Hopefully all of you out there can get a sense from this event of the kind of history and arguments that you know you can find in this book. Is really congratulations on a really beautiful collection. I mean, this is full of socialist activists who are out there doing the work and writing about the struggle, with a really insightful afterword by Remy Kanazi, which I really enjoyed. I appreciated that. And just want to thank you all for really a fantastic book, and people should definitely check it out, pick it up, and learn from it, so we can go out and actually organize in solidarity with Palestine. Thank you all.
Yeah, thank you all for joining us here tonight. Like I said, we had tons of comrades and customers excited, so I really appreciate you giving your time to us. And we'll see you next time.